Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. We begin by praising Allah and we send peace and blessings upon the last and final messenger Muhammad. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us sincerity in this endeavor and in this venture of studying Islam. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to teach us that which will benefit us and to allow us to benefit from that which we learn and that which we've already learned in life. Ameen. So beginning, this class is Beliefs 1. It's going to be an overview of Islamic beliefs. So let's get started immediately. Belief in Allah and in the Messenger of Allah and in all the messengers of Allah is the foundation upon which Islam is built. You absolutely need this before you go and talk about anything. That's why it's very important that these beliefs about believing in Allah, believing in the Messenger, and all the other fundamental beliefs have to be very clear and firmly rooted in the minds and in the hearts of all Muslims before they're going to be addressing anything else. Because you cannot fulfill the objective of Islam or the objective of any religion without knowing its absolute fundamentals. Because every single thing is built upon that. So when Allah tells you to avoid alcohol, or when Allah tells you to pray, or when Allah tells you to behave in a certain way with your parents, if your belief is not firmly grounded in these things, then you're not going to have a very strong foundation to stand upon, whether it's with regards to action, or it's with regards to some doubt that crops up in your mind. Now, naturally, people, they feel more comfortable and they feel more confident in ideas that they've arrived at through research, through contemplation, through reflection. So if somebody says, you know what, well, all of a sudden they heard an idea and somebody told them something, and they say, okay, well, for example, somebody comes and tells you that they just discovered an ancient civilization in Antarctica. They unearthed it. Just came out of nowhere, and there had been people living there for a very long time, and you believe it. That belief compared to you going and researching and trying to find out, well, where did the news source come from? Who is the person? What tools did they use? What was the civilization like? What kind of pictures do we have? When you go and embark on your own research, you feel not only more comfortable, you feel more confident in what you're believing now. So it doesn't mean that you didn't believe or you did believe in the beginning, but you feel more comfortable because you've put effort into trying to understand it. And you've put some, you've taken some time to think about it and to dispel some doubts. So the same thing applies when it comes to the Islamic beliefs that can be proven through the rationality, which we're going to be discussing. So for example, let's take the existence of God, the existence of Allah. Somebody, it's naturally ingrained, which we'll be talking about, but somebody who's reflected upon it, somebody who's thought about it, someone who's been taking a time to sit down and really see, okay, what does this mean and how did I arrive at this belief and why do I believe these things? That person is going to be more confident and they're also going to feel more comfortable in their beliefs. So studying with proofs, studying with evidences makes that person's faith stronger and it makes them more comfortable. Studying the essential beliefs of Islam, like I said before, creates that foundation that somebody has to stand on. If that foundation is weak, if that foundation is shaky, that anyone who comes with any doubt that they throw in your way, all of a sudden you're going to find that foundation crumbling down. So if somebody has a solid foundation and then all of a sudden somebody throws a doubt or throws something in there, let's say, that doesn't seem to make sense because they don't understand this, doesn't seem to make sense for them in the Quran or in the Hadith or about something else. If they have a firm foundation to stand upon, then they're going to go back on that foundation, and that thing will remain a question which they would like answered, but it's not going to destroy the entire belief. But if they don't have that foundation, any type of doubt, any type of provocation, any type of propaganda can affect that person, that as soon as it goes through, and then that's it. They have nothing to stand on, they're going to fall off, and their iman will be gone, their faith will be gone. Now, people of most religions, I would say today, have this confusion with regards to their own religion, with regards to their own beliefs, whether it's belief in God or whether it's their own fundamental beliefs. And the thing is, as Muslims, we usually say, well, Allah has preserved, He's guaranteed and He's promised that Islam is going to be the preserved religion because it's the last religion. And that's true. But that does not mean that all of its followers are going to be preserved in their beliefs. So just because Islam has been guaranteed to be preserved by Allah doesn't mean that you or I or other people are guaranteed to remain on the straight path and believe in these things. So we need to take these doubts and we need to take these confusions, particularly today, we need to take them very seriously. Because many, even Muslims today, they have a very warped vision of what Islam really is, or they have a very weak conviction of that Islam in their hearts. And you can see that manifesting in their behavior, in their actions, their attitudes, whether it is what they say, whether it's what they do, or whether it's the style in which they're addressing questions or whatever it may be, there is that doubt and that hesitation that shows itself. So it's not something that just remains hidden. You can see it oftentimes. So it's something that Muslims are affected by as well, and they need to take it very seriously. Due to this confusion, one of the things we're going to be doing in this class is we're going to try to not only present the fundamental, essential Islamic beliefs, we're going to try to present some convincing arguments which will, inshallah, strengthen your faith, God willing. And also, we're going to be talking about some common dangers. Dangers past and present that have confused Muslims and caused their faith to either be lost or to be confused. Okay, so what we're going to be talking about, we're first, in this introduction, we're going to be talking about theology as a science. Now, theology, I'm translating the word aqidah, the Arabic word aqidah is theology. It could be translated as theology or it could be translated as creed. It's been translated both ways. Okay? Neither of them are great translations, but there's really nothing else to use in the English language. Then we'll be talking about iman or faith or belief. Iman versus the science of aqidah. And we have to see the difference between the two. And then we'll talk about the purpose of the science and why do we study it. So, theology as a science, meaning the science of aqidah, what is it? What exactly is it? Well, it's a science which studies the beliefs of Islam as contained in the Quran and the Sunnah. The Sunnah is the practice of the Prophet, peace be upon him. So what is the science actually doing in reality? The science is trying to figure out exactly what the texts of the Quran and the Sunnah or the Hadith are trying to tell us about beliefs. So the category is all about beliefs. But what it's trying to do as a science is trying to tell us what these texts are actually telling us that we must believe in and what we must reject. So basically, to put it another way, you're taking the Quran and Sunnah and you're taking every single verse and every single hadith on the subject of beliefs that are considered to be most important, and you're structuring them and you're phrasing them in a certain way and in a certain form and a certain pattern. That's exactly what the science of aqidah or the science of theology intends to do. And most people, when they see it, when they see the arguments that are presented in this science or in these books that scholars have written on this subject, they'll oftentimes say that, you know what, I've read the Quran and I've read the Hadith and I didn't even realize that that argument was in the Quran the whole time. Because sometimes you're reading and you just kind of pass through the argument. Allah says, reflect on the heavens and the earth, and you say, oh, okay, that's good. And then a story comes in and you're going through, and then someone rephrases it for you in another way, and all of a sudden, directly from the Quran, but just rephrased or resaid, restated, and then all of a sudden you think, wow, that's an amazing argument. You say, well, all of that just came directly from the Quran or directly from a hadith. You say, I can't believe that was there. I can't believe I missed that the first time. So that's pretty much what this science is going to be doing as well. Helps you to connect the dots between some of the arguments that are made in the Quran as well as in the Sunnah. Also, we're going to be studying the intellectual legacy of Islam, which means 1400 years of scholarship where Muslims have been reflecting upon these issues. They've been thinking about beliefs. It's not just we talk about Islamic law and that's it, or we talk about tafsir or explanation of Quran and that's it. There has been this ongoing process of reflecting upon what Muslims should believe, why they should believe them, how to convince somebody else, all of these things for a very long time, for several centuries. So we're going to be benefiting from that intellectual legacy that we have. But this intellectual legacy has its positive aspects and it has its negative aspects. And this is very important to understand from the beginning. Some of the debates that Muslim scholars have engaged in the past are very relevant for our time. And we can benefit a lot rather than having to start from scratch. Some atheist like Richard Dawkins comes up with an argument. Before we go and start engaging that, we can see, well, what have Muslim scholars answered? How have they answered arguments similar to these type of arguments? And what can we learn from their experience? That can be very positive. But there's also a negative aspect, is that if we start studying arguments that are not very relevant to our context, for example, the debates, excessive debates about whether the Quran is created or not created. This, for most people, I would say in America, this is not a question that they ever really asked, nor do they care too much to get a really good answer to, because it's not really a matter of debate. At that time it was relevant, at that time it had a certain purpose, but it really doesn't serve the purpose. So if we get into it too much and it becomes into polemics, what's going to happen is we're going to find ourselves taking a bunch of intellectual baggage and we're just getting weighed down with that and we can't move forward onto the real topics that we need to be addressing. The science has actually led many people back to the true beliefs in Islam. So it's worked. Explaining these ideas, discussing them, debating them and giving good explanations to people has worked in the past. For many people, it's helped their faith. It also has led to many misconceptions and confused many people as well. So what we're going to try, we're not trying to confuse you. The goal is to try to help you to get a stronger faith, stronger foundation. But you have to realize that if you don't study properly and you don't put in the effort to study, sometimes this science, especially in the more advanced level, this is a beginning class, in the more advanced level, this can actually confuse you, perplex you, and you'll become lost in a maze of hair-splitting arguments. And you don't want to do that. You don't want to become confused. The purpose is to guide you. Let's talk about faith and the science of theology. Iman, the idea of Iman versus Aqidah. So there's a term Iman, which means faith or belief. And then there's a science of Aqidah, the science of theology or the science of beliefs. They're two different things. So there's two categories of Islamic teachings, if we had to break it down. The first is to believe in everything that Allah and His Messenger taught. And when I say Allah, His Messenger taught, in His capacity as a prophet. So for example, what do we believe in? We believe in the existence of Allah. We believe in the attributes of Allah as defined by the Quran. We believe in the truth of the prophethood, that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was a true prophet. We believe in resurrection, that when we die we will be resurrected. We believe in judgment, that when we're resurrected, we're going to be held accountable in front of Allah. We believe in the necessity of prayer and the necessity of fasting. That's a tenet of belief, not action. Meaning that you have to pray 5 times a day, or you have to fast in the month of Ramadan. That's different from the act itself. Believing that you have to is in the realm of beliefs, etc. The things which can be acted upon is the second aspect, or the second category of Islamic teachings. And those are things which you practice. Right? So for example, praying, giving charity, fasting, avoiding eating pork, refraining from interest. All of these things are things which can be acted upon. So when it comes to beliefs, you're supposed to be accepting them, internalizing them. When it comes to things which you act upon, what's known as the Sharia or the law, Islamic law, those are things which we should be doing. So there are beliefs and then there are actions. The beliefs is like the root. If you take an example of a tree, it's like the roots. And the Sharia or the law or the actions is the branch. And what happens is everything is connected. So for example, when somebody tells you should pray, and let's take an example, you're telling your children to pray, right? And your children go ahead and they pray because you told them to. Okay? At that level, they don't have an understanding. But once you become a mature adult, you're not praying anymore because your parents told you to. that's not a good reason. It's not a sufficient reason. The reason has to be rooted in the fact that because you believe in Allah, you believe in His Messenger, you believe in the Quran, and you believe that Allah told you to do these things, now you're praying. So that the actions or the practice are branches coming out of the roots of faith. And if the faith is either weak or not there in the first place, there's not going to be many branches coming out of that tree. To clarify a little bit more, the science of theology or aqidah basically studies the individual words in the Quran and the Sunnah. Words like ahad, which means one. What does the word ahad actually mean? Can you possibly fit the concept of Trinity into the idea of ahad? As mentioned in the Quran, when you say قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ, say He is Allah the One. Is it possible to fit a multiplicity into the one and say, well, yes, Allah is one, ahad, but in so many different forms or in 3 different parts or in multiple parts or whatever? That's what the science of theology is trying to study and give you the explanation of what these individual words actually mean. And secondly, it's trying to formulate proofs for these beliefs to be accepted on rational grounds. And also to remove doubts and provide arguments against doubts that come up. That's the science itself. Now, what are beliefs? That's the science of theology. What are Islamic beliefs? Islamic beliefs are actually what Allah and His Messenger really intended. Allah wanted you to believe this, and that's exactly what beliefs are. So I hope we understand a little bit about the difference between beliefs and the science of beliefs, or the science of theology. To put it another way, it's like fiqh. For those of you who took the Islamic law class, how many of you did take the Islamic law class? Okay. Those of you who took the class, you're more familiar with this. The difference between the word fiqh and the word sharia is what? Who can tell me? So sharia is what Allah actually intended for you to do. So do you wipe your entire head with both hands when you're making wudu? Or do you wipe a fourth or a third or a few spots of hair? And the scholars have differed on this, right? What Allah really intended is the sharia. Wiping the head is the sharia. How much of the head to wipe and what should we do? Our understanding of it, the scholars' understanding of it, is called fiqh. So fiqh is the human interpretation of the sharia. Okay, same thing with faith. When it comes to the word iman, if you want to take faith as iman, and we want to take the science of theology as aqidah, right? Then aqidah, or the science of theology, is the study of what Allah really intended and wanted us to believe, and that's iman. So iman is like sharia, and aqidah is like fiqh. Right? Exactly. So fiqh meaning understanding. So the fiqh of beliefs is iman. Okay? So hopefully that's clear. Actually no, the other way around. The fiqh of iman is aqidah. Right? Right? Yes. No, the fiqh of iman is aqidah. Don't worry about any of these terms, by the way. Just understand the concept. I'm not going to test you on the terms. You don't need to know any terms. Okay? Just understand the concept. Okay? So the beliefs are clear. But the human interpretation of the beliefs is a human interpretation, which is relatively certain. But there's some room for differences of acceptable opinions. Which is why if you see scholars differing on a matter of faith, say, this doesn't make any sense. Either we believe it or we don't believe it. If you don't believe it, then you're a kafir. You're not a Muslim. No, there are certain things which there can be a different opinion, even in matters of faith, the same way that there are some things where you can have different opinion when it comes to sharia, when it comes to Islamic law, what actually Allah intended you to do. And there are some things which you cannot have any difference of opinion. So, for example, there is no difference of opinion if somebody comes and says, yes, I believe Allah is one but manifest in 3 different people. It's not acceptable. If somebody comes in Islamic law and Sharia and says, yes, well, yeah, I agree that we're not supposed to eat pig. However, if I raise my pig in a laboratory and don't allow it, don't allow it to be exposed to any outside air, and I feed it glucose the entire time, therefore it's much purer than other animals, therefore I can go ahead and eat that type of pork. Okay, there's no room for that opinion. Okay, in case you ever got that idea. It's not gonna happen. These terms, by the way, the terms of Aqidah, for example, doesn't exist in the Quran or in the Sunnah anywhere. These are terms that were actually coined by scholars, which shows you that it's a science. It's a science that came up later in order to study things. So sometimes people get very, trigger happy with the word Aqidah. It's not actually there in the Quran and Sunnah, but it's important. The term that was used at that time was Iman, referring to the actual beliefs themselves. Okay? The study of, we talked about that, difference of opinion. Beliefs do not change, so hopefully that's clear. Iman does not change. Aqidah, however, can change, and it can adapt with time and with generations. Why does the science of theology change? There's a few reasons. One reason is because there are new questions that arise. New questions have arisen in the past, and new questions will continue to arise as long as people continue to think. And people will think. So as long as people come up with new different things, those answers sometimes need a response, because if it's confusing people. So therefore the response is there, and new questions arise, therefore new explanations need to be given. Another reason why it changes is because an argument may be able to convince one group of people and not convince another group of people. For example, there are certain arguments that we'll be talking about in class which may convince someone who's young, but it will not convince somebody who's older. And vice versa. There may be some arguments that convince somebody who's older and it may not convince somebody who's younger. Or it may convince somebody who grew up in America and it will not convince somebody who grew up in Mauritania or in Japan. So that's the reason why this science can change, because you're trying to provide an explanation which is convincing, and something which is convincing may be different depending on people's nature, where they grew up, their background, and all of those things. Okay? So therefore you need modified explanations. What is the purpose? What is the purpose of this science which we're going to be studying? Well, as a Muslim, everyone is required to believe in certain things in order to be Muslim. But not everyone needs to have detailed explanations and proofs. Right? So it really depends on the needs of the individual. Somebody who's going to be going to college and enrolling in a theology or a philosophy class is more likely more likely needs to study this science or this subject than somebody who is just going to be interacting with gadgets in their laboratory or something like that. It depends on people's background. It depends what kind of discussions they're getting into. It depends what kind of co-workers you're encountering. It depends whether you open your doors for the missionaries on a Saturday or Sunday morning. All of these things make a difference in terms of how much you need to study it. Some detailed explanations may actually confuse some individuals, and some may enlighten other individuals. So if you take a look at a doctor, let's look at medical science, for example. If a doctor, were to give some people the detailed explanation of exactly what your illness is, what is causing it, and how this medicine is supposed to work, there may be some people who will become so confused that they may say, well, you know what? Based upon the explanation I just heard, you just contradicted yourself. Therefore, you prescribed me the wrong medicine. I should be taking this other medicine because I read about it on Wikipedia and it was telling me that this actually can treat this. So that explanation could actually be harmful for someone who may not be an expert in that field, whereas for an expert practitioner, they may have a different level of needing that explanation as well as understanding that explanation. So just keep that in mind. So here are the reasons why people generally study this science. And you're probably, when we go through these reasons, I want you to classify yourself. Where are you? Okay, number one, for people to establish a solid foundation in their mind and in their heart about Islamic beliefs, and to see that convincing evidence so that their faith is strong and put at rest. Oftentimes people believe, It's not that you don't believe, but oftentimes people cannot explain why. So when they say, well, explain to me, why do you believe this? I say, well, I don't know. I'm very convinced, but I can't put it in words. I have no doubts in my mind, but I just can't articulate it. So that's one, is that it's formed, it's there, but it becomes stronger. The goal is not to explain it, but to become stronger. Number two is to clarify doubts and misconceptions. So people have become confused about a lot of things. Let's take one example. Many people have become confused, or many people have a question that how is it that Allah can know the future, right? Allah can know the future, but at the same time you have free will. You say, well, how does that work? So you know what? All these things are happening to me, or I was drinking, right? I was drinking wine. Somebody says, well, Allah already knew this was going to happen. He already decreed that this was going to happen. So therefore, why should I be held responsible? So these kind of questions come up, and when these questions come up, people need to understand what Islam is really saying about divine decree or about the knowledge of Allah, and how to reconcile the concepts of free will with divine decree or with the knowledge of Allah. So these are things that come up and confuse people. So the second thing is to clarify these type of doubts and misconceptions that people have, and we will be covering this topic in this class. Number three, to learn how to convince other people about Islamic beliefs and to spread the message of Islam. So that in reality, it's actually a requirement. It's necessary for Muslims to spread the message of Islam in their capacity. In whatever way that they are able to. And this is not the class to talk about the details of that, but just know that and understand that. So a lot of people, they have a desire to go and convey the beliefs to their friends, to their family, to other people, but they may not know the best way to do that. Or they may not be the best at that, even if they think they're good at that. They may not be very good at it in reality, and they get into arguments and all of that. So one of the other reasons for studying this in a systematic way is to be able to present these explanations to other people so that they can also benefit from the message of Islam. Number four is to learn what beliefs are incorrect and to learn why they're incorrect. So it's not sufficient to simply say that, as Muslims, for some it may be sufficient, but for others it's not sufficient to simply say, the Quran tells me that Jesus was a human being and that he was not divine and that he was not God. But if you were to get in a discussion with somebody, could you actually defend that on rational grounds? That's a question. So that's another reason why people study these things, in order to understand how to do that, how to explain why, and to understand what is wrong. Also so that they're not going to be misled by propaganda and arguments and other things. So to protect oneself, to aid other people. These notes are all online, by the way, so you can download them. In Islam, there are two types of proofs. And we're going to be covering both as well in this science. There are two types of proofs. The first type of proof is rational, what's called aqli. Right? Rational proof basically means that you're making an argument without having to present a text. So there's a difference between making an argument by saying, look, the Quran says this, and by making an argument by saying, look, this is the way it is, this caused this, and therefore your explanation doesn't make sense, this explanation makes sense, and is convincing to other people. The second proof is textual, which is called naqli, or naql, it's from naql, meaning that it's something that is textual based on a verse or based on a hadith of the Prophet, peace be upon him, statement of the Prophet. So these are two types of proofs. The rational proofs that we're going to be studying are used to establish and to maintain the beliefs of Islam, the foundational beliefs of Islam. The textual proofs are going to be used to clarify what the Quran and what the Sunnah actually are saying in reality, so that no one has a misunderstanding of that, what it's actually trying to say. Okay, and also it's going to provide an explanation for the belief that is textual, but to show that it makes sense and it's neither irrational nor is it contradictory. There's a difference between proving something is rational and proving something is not irrational or illogical. One of them is done with the text and one of them is done in order to establish belief, which we'll be talking about. Okay. Methodology. So before we begin, lastly, we need a methodology. A methodology tells you how you're approaching a subject. So you can pick up any book on Islamic beliefs, and you may like the author, or you may like the institution that published it, or it may be a friend of yours gave it to you, or whatever it may be. But how do you differentiate one book from another, or one method of studying from another? You need a methodology. And the methodology should be defined. So the methodology which we'll be using are a few points here. Number one, we're going to be combining academic rational proofs with persuasive rhetoric. Meaning, this is not going to be a dry class about, oh, this is the cosmological argument for the existence of God. The response to that has been this, and this is the response to that, and thank you, class. Go figure it out on your own. We're not going to do that. There's going to be a little bit more feeling in there, in order to motivate people to come, because this is a seminary. This is a college, but it's a seminary at the same time. So it is belief-based. So just keep that in mind. Number two, we will be presenting the essence of what the Quran and Sunnah teaches, while avoiding minor issues, which are not really that fundamental to argue about or to necessarily take a stance over the other on. So we're going to try to focus on those things while maintaining the position, or while maintaining the beliefs. So we're going to be looking at different theological schools, and there are different schools of thought which do exist. So on some issues we will be looking at the differences of opinion that have taken place throughout Islamic history. We'll be looking at what the different schools of thought, yes, there are different madhabs in this science, what they had said about certain issues, but generally we're always going to be leaning back towards what are known as the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, the mainstream Islam, or the community of mainstream Muslims. And that's in the broadest sense of the term. The broadest sense of the term means, according to many scholars, that the schools of thought that fall into that category are three, which we'll discuss in more detail. The schools are the Athari school, the Ash'ari school, and the Maturidi school. And we'll be getting into it a little bit. We're not going to talk too much about it, but we're going to be getting into those a little bit in this class. Thirdly, we'll be specifying historical causes behind some of the debates, in order to explain that these were not only theoretical. It's not just some random guy came up with some weird question, and then all of a sudden it started. There was a historical reason why the debate started. So for example, I just mentioned in front of you, I mentioned to you that whether the Quran is created or not. How many of you before this class have heard that this has been a debate? Okay, less than 50% of you, right? But how many of you know the context and the historical reasons behind that debate? Okay, like 2 of you. Okay, so the thing is, it's very important to understand the context behind the debate, to understand, well, why did it take place? So to show, it'll help you contextualize things so that you can understand them better, you can interpret them better. And fourthly, explaining the effects that Islamic beliefs have on the lives of Muslims. So we're going to try to explain what does the belief actually, what effect is it really going to have on your life. Hopefully, inshallah, we will get to this point before the end of class, if we have time. So let's move on. So, faith. When we talk about faith between nature and proof, okay, between the natural disposition and between proof. Let's take a question. Is believing in Allah and believing in or accepting prophets and messengers when they come to you, is it something that's natural and is ingrained in the hearts and minds of people from their birth? Or is it something that you have to acquire as a result of your effort and your hard work, and you have to try and figure it out on your own, such that it wasn't there in the first place and then you acquire it afterwards? All right, this is a question that Muslim scholars have debated throughout history. So, what do you say? Is faith ingrained in the hearts of people when they're born, or is it something that they actually have to acquire through effort and research? The thing is, if some scholars have said yes, it's natural, and that's the focus. Some scholars said no, it's acquired. And the thing is, they were just emphasizing one point over the other. In reality, there's an aspect of both. So how does it work? People are born with this natural disposition towards believing in Allah and towards accepting His prophets when they come. And this belief though, even though it's there, it can be weakened or it can even disappear due to external events. So due to experiences in your life, due to the type of company that you used to keep, due to the people you engage in debate with, due to other factors that have been there throughout your life. So what happens is that you need to work. You need to work in order to remove those barriers to bring you back to the natural disposition. So let's take a look at some of the proofs in this regard to prove that faith is natural. Natural, what we call in Arabic the fitrah, meaning it's built into the very person's being. So some of the proofs. Belief is a natural instinct, okay, according to Islam. It's like a natural instinct such that when you experience hunger, right? When you experience hunger, you want to eat, right? That's natural. Unless somebody has an illness, when they experience hunger, what do? They want to go and they want to fulfill this sensation that they're having, and they want to appease their appetite. Same thing if somebody's thrown into water. Even if a child is thrown into water, what do they start doing? Start moving around, right? Trying to stay afloat. This is a natural instinct that's built into people. Everyone has it. It's universal. It doesn't matter where you grew up. It doesn't matter which family you're raised into. As long as you're physically sound and healthy, these things are built into you. So from the Islamic perspective, this faith and this belief in Allah and the belief in the Prophet when he's going to come to you and you accept him on that basis is ingrained in the people. It's ingrained naturally in the people. However, you can see this proof in individuals when you study them, and you can see this proof throughout societies in history when you study history. So let's take a look at some of the proofs. Proofs from psychology. This is the first method of talking about this. There's a natural tendency that people have to believe in a higher being. Modern studies have been conducted as well. So there's a lot of traditional ways of proving this, but a lot of modern studies have recently come out. Let's take an example of, take an example of study conducted by Oxford University in 2011. Very large study. It had 57 researchers who conducted 40 separate studies in 20 different countries. So it's a very expensive, it was like £2 billion or something like that, study, where they went around and they asked different children and they asked different people about why they believe certain things when their parents are telling them. And I'm not going to go through the entire details of the study because that would take a very long time. But they themselves said that, you know what, there is a programming, a hardwired programming that children as well as young adults when they're growing up generally have to start believing and seeing the world as being created and therefore believing in the existence of a creator and seeing all that work around them. Let's take a few quotes here. Any quotes here? No. So Dr. Justin Barrett, University of Oxford Center for Anthropology and Mind, he says, the preponderance of scientific evidence for the past 10 years or so has shown a predisposition to see the natural world as designed and purposeful. Okay, so what is he basically saying? He's saying that there's a natural inclination for people to read purpose into the world, the way that they read purpose into everything else. So when you see, for example, a pen, right? You see a pen. I don't have a pen on me, but you imagine there's a pen here, okay? And you look at it and you start analyzing it and you say, well, I wonder what this is for, right? So you could do so many things with a pen, right? You can go and stab somebody with it. You shouldn't be doing that, by the way, as a Muslim. But you could fling it at somebody. You can so many different things you can figure out to do with a pen. But the more you analyze it, the more you look at it, the more you reflect upon it, it starts giving you some attributes and telling you, okay, well, you know what? There's some lead. It pushes out from here. It's ink, there's a little ball and it's rolling ink and stuff like that. It kind of gets used to do all of these things. You can kind of start figuring out, there's a purpose behind this. It was designed in a specific way. It has a reason. It has a purpose, especially knowing the science of writing and the importance of books and all of that. So you kind of get a purpose behind it. People look for purpose naturally. And that's what we're talking about, the fitrah. Okay, that's what we're talking about, the natural disposition to be inclined towards that belief. So he says the world is purposeful and that some kind of intelligent being is behind that purpose. Keep in mind, these are not religious people who are studying, who are saying this. These are very, very secular-minded researchers. So basically he says, if we threw a handful of people on an island, and this is a common question that people ask, if we threw a handful of people on an island and they raised themselves, then he says, I think that they would believe in God. The reason being, so what they're trying to show actually, is that atheism or disbelief in God, for example, is not the default position as some people assume. The reason being is because people are naturally trying to read purpose in to their surroundings. And that's why it's very easy for them to accept. Professor Pascal Boyer, who is an anthropologist at Washington University, he says, religious thinking seems to be the path of least resistance for our cognitive systems, which means that when people are presented with the idea of belief in something, right, or belief in God or belief in other things, there's the least resistance that you have for it. By contrast, disbelief is generally the work of deliberate, effortful work against our natural cognitive dispositions. Meaning that it's one of the most difficult, it's a very difficult ideology to propagate. Meaning most people are not going to believe in it based upon the way that their minds are naturally structured. Okay, and you can check out some of those studies for more details. But that's one proof for it from psychology. Okay, and that's how children form beliefs. Okay, number 2, proofs from historical experience. Okay, French philosopher Henry Bergson made a good statement, and he's a researcher. He said every civilization, he said there's been many human societies that have been found which have no sciences and no arts. So think about all the societies that have existed in the past, whether they be great civilizations or small little tribal civilizations. Okay, there have been many of them. They don't have science. They don't even have any arts. They didn't produce any pottery. They didn't produce any drawings. They didn't produce anything else. But he says you cannot find, for the most part, you cannot find a single civilization or society without some kind of religion. Without some kind of religion. So he's trying to show that it's naturally based on people. The historical experience tells us that you will find some type of religion always throughout all these different histories. Now there's an argument. The argument will be that these societies throughout history did not believe in one God. They did not believe in Allah the way that Muslims believe in Allah. So how do you explain that? What is the reason? Well, the point is not to show that they believed in one God. The point is to show that people are naturally inclined to believe in something above and beyond this material realm. And from our perspective, anything that is a corruption of these beliefs, a belief in one God, is a corruption of the natural disposition. But it doesn't deny the natural disposition itself. That's a corruption of the natural disposition. Now here's the thing. Another argument that you can make is, well, let's take a look at some of these societies which have rejected religion and they've rejected God completely. Right? There have been societies like that, particularly in the recent past. And if you look throughout history, you might be able to find one or two, maybe small ones, with some type of system like that. So how would that fit in with this proof? Because usually someone will say, if you can show one exception, it'll break the entire rule. So you have to be able to explain that exception. So how would you explain the exception of the atheism of the previous century? Let's take the Soviet Union, for example. A communist, atheistic society. How would you explain that within the context of this proof from historical experience? Okay, that's true. There were several churches, but at the same time, there was a large number of people who bought into the philosophy of communism, right? How many people actually did buy into it and accepted it wholeheartedly? Several, or at least socialism, forms of socialism, right? Anyone else? Okay, the people weren't always atheists. Over time, they were cultured to believe in the values that they were given. Okay, that's true. They've gone way away from the fitrah such that they've just gone so far that there's just nothing left to bring them back. Okay. So they did have a lot of propaganda. Okay, that's true. Definitely true. Good. So they elevated their leaders like gods. Okay, so give some examples. Mao Zedong, you gave an example, right? In China. Okay. That's right. So that's one example. So take example of China, Chinese communism. They took their leader and the little book that he wrote, right? What was the book called? Like the red book or green book, whatever it's called. It's like a little book. That book is like their sacred book. Everyone takes that book as like absolute sacred. Is his picture prevalent around? Everywhere. His picture is considered to be something really, really important. Take a look at the former Soviet Union. Who was the founder of communism, or at least heavily influenced? Who are some of the founders of communism? Karl Marx, Stalin was the leader afterwards, and Lenin. All right, so let's just take a look at these three figures. You ever seen that picture where you see all three figures in one? It's a picture of them, right? You see the flag, right? What kind of rituals did the Soviet Union establish for their leaders and their idea, right? Their idea of nationalism, right, of their own country is something that's absolutely unquestionable. So when you have a flag, for example, the Soviet flag, very similar to like United States flag, where we have this nationalism, this patriotism there. What happens if you go in front of some people and you take the flag? It's just cloth, right? You take the flag and you were to throw it in the trash can, what would happen? What would happen? Yeah, okay, you go to Alabama and you do that. All right? It's going to happen to you. All right? Why? Why do people have such a strong belief? Because one of the things is because that's become a symbol for them, and a symbol that's held at such a level where you put the flag up there, everyone has to stand in front in respect. You can't move around. You got to take your hat off. You got to either put your hand over your heart, or before they came up with the whole hand over the heart thing, does anyone know what the pledge used to be? It used to be this. Yes, it used to be that. And then they decided, you know what, this resembles a little bit too much, so we need to modify it. Right? So the thing is that. So that's very important. It's very important. So what you're saying is they've taken them as gods. Exactly. So do they have statues of Marx? Absolutely. Can you misbehave in front of the statue? Absolutely not. You have to stand in a specific way in front of the flag, in front of the statue. You mess with the statue, you're in big trouble. So in fact, if you look at the way that idol worshippers would practice their idol worship, these new systems oftentimes resemble the same type of rituals, but without calling it belief. So what you do is, it's not that you can argue whether it's a religion or it's not a religion. That's not the point. The point is that you see similar manifestations when people are practicing some form of idolatry or religion or whatever it is, when they're actually practicing, when it actually becomes, this type of materialism becomes ingrained within a society as well. So they're replacing the actual fitrah or the natural disposition to believe in something higher and to worship something with believing and worshipping something either that's abstract, like a concept, like communism, or like socialism, or nationalism. The idea that your country is, and you're killing people on behalf of the flag. The flag is there and you're sacrificing people at the altar of nationalism or at the altar of communism. Very similar. Or you worship people. So basically what's happened is this natural disposition has led them towards the same thing, but they went in a different direction and they modified terms and they modified things. Yes, so it could be their own desires as well. So we're going to talk a little bit how desires play a role as well in modifying and corrupting the natural disposition. But right now we want to focus on how is it that the fitrah is actually there. So you're saying that they've replaced Allah or God with the desires themselves. Okay, that could be another explanation. So anyways, these are some of the things. These are some of the responses to the arguments. So modern day nationalism, fall of the Soviet Union. So when you find somebody denying that, you know what, proof from historical experience, well, you say, well, I can show you some examples to the contrary. So therefore it shows you that belief is not natural. Well, the thing is, there's a difference between something being natural and somebody going away from a natural way. So for example, let's take nudity. Complete nudity. Do nudist colonies exist today? Absolutely. Have there been some nudist communities in the past? Probably, right? But is nudity, from our understanding of historical experience, is it something that we can consider, full nudity, is it something that we can consider to be the default position that societies and people have had throughout history? History does not testify to that, right? Outside of evolutionary theory, talking about societal-wise. It does not testify to that in terms of the societies that we've discovered, right? Outside of, because they've not come up with the first human being species is, according to evolutionary theory, has already been within a societal structure. So outside of Darwin's theory of evolution, from a historical perspective, right, you don't find that. You don't find that. Therefore, it's not the natural position. So that's the second proof. Proof from revelation. Is that the first? That's it. The third proof is proof from revelation regarding natural disposition. And that is that belief is something natural, and rejection of faith is something that was acquired, not the default state. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, so set your face to the faith uprightly. This being the nature designed by Allah on which He has created mankind. So meaning this is something that's ingrained in your very nature, in your creation, and there is no change in Allah's creation. So meaning that there should be no change in Allah's creation. But if somebody changes it and goes away from that natural disposition, then that's something that they're making a mistake in. The Prophet, peace be upon him, said that Allah said, I have created all of my servants to be on the true religion. So the Prophet is basically saying that everyone has been created with this way of going towards the true religion, but then they choose and make decisions otherwise to go against that. But they were naturally going this way, and either somebody pushed them away or they pushed themselves away in the opposite direction. Another statement of the Prophet is that every child is born with a natural disposition towards the truth. The words that are being used in all three of these are fitrah. Fitrah meaning natural disposition. Every child is born with a natural disposition towards the truth, but his parents then raise him as a Jew or as a Christian or as a fire worshipper. And then he said in another narration, he said, take a look at an animal that gives birth to another animal. Right? Do you see any defects of that animal being passed over when somebody goes and messes with it? So let's say you go, you chop off the ear of an animal. This is what they used to do. They used to chop off the ears of camels for sacrifice and all of that in Arabian society. So if you go and you injure an animal, all right, or you go and you chop off one of its arms or something like that, and then it gives birth, right, without modifying its genes and all that, you chop off its arm, gives birth. Is that defect that the animal had gotten due to the societal circumstance and all that, is it going to be passed on to the next animal? No, it's not. So there's a certain default state and a certain way that all people are naturally going to be on, and that's what's known as the fitrah or the natural disposition. And then the parents go and they raise them in a certain way, they modify some of their beliefs, they tell them to do this, they give them a religious education, and then they end up being something different. And we're going to come back to this and talk more in detail about whether Muslims fall into the same category or not. Okay. So let's take a look at some obstacles to the natural disposition of faith. Okay. So all these proofs that we just talked about, right, they give rise to a legitimate question, which we've kind of already answered, that history shows people who have rejected Allah. History shows people, not only history, the Quran mentions people who have rejected Allah. In fact, it mentions so many people, the majority of people it mentions are those who rejected Allah rather than those that accepted Allah. So that's a historical experience. So the historical experience is telling us that people rejected Allah and they rejected their prophets. And if we're saying that the natural disposition is to accept Allah and to accept the prophets, then how do we explain all of these things? Well, we need to explain some of these things in this way. Polytheism, atheism, how do you explain those type of things? We kind of hinted at it. The Quran gives us an answer. The Quran says that there are barriers that are placed on people's hearts that prevent them from going towards this natural disposition that they were actually created upon. So the verse in the Quran that says that Allah has set a seal on their hearts and on their hearing and on their eyes, there's a covering. Now this is something which people have done to themselves, but this is the effect. So the cause was their own behavior, which we're going to look at what behavior causes this. But the effect of this is that they're unable to see. There's barriers that are preventing them from doing certain things. So let's take an example. It's natural for parents to care for their children, right? Generally. There's a natural disposition that almost all parents have to care for their children. At least at the infant stage, right? At least let's say in the first month of birth, right? At minimum. But do you find people who take their children and bury them alive and kill them? Yes, you have in the past. And today, you still find people dumping their children, their baby that they just delivered into a trash can or a dumpster. Right? You will find that taking place. Now, what exactly happened? This is kind of like what Khalid was saying. What's happened is that this is not natural, it's not part of the natural disposition. But what people have done is their selfish desires of their comfort and their emphasis on what they want to do and their freedom or their time or their schedule, whatever it may be, has taken precedence and it's gone over as a barrier to this natural disposition such that it cannot act. It cannot manifest itself anymore. It doesn't have the ability to override and actually give care to that child. So this is just an example of one of the barriers that can be there, and that's the desires. The desires, a person's desires and inclinations and whims cause this natural disposition to become covered up such that it's not going to be acting anymore and it's not going to have a very strong effect. Alright, so that's what Allah mentioned in this verse. So there are so many things that can cover up the natural disposition, but there are three main things which are very common that many people encounter in their life that cause their natural disposition to be covered up. One of them is selfish desires. The second one is arrogance, which is like from desires, but it's a separate category in and of itself. And the third is blind imitation. Okay, blind imitation of parents and ancestors. Okay, so let's take a look at selfish desires first. The Quran, now we can go back to the Quran. So the Quran talks about how this works on an individual level as well as on a societal level. So you can see people's desires overcoming them as individuals, and you can see it taking place in a particular society as well. So what will happen is that a person starts choosing things which are outside their intrinsic nature, which they were not actually inclined to from the beginning. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, those are the ones on whose hearts Allah has put a seal and they have followed their desires. So it's referring to a specific group of people who they followed their desires. So it specifies what was the problem and what was the cause for their hearts being sealed. It was their following of desires. Another example. After them came a group of people who, as a society, came a group of people who neglected their prayers and they followed their selfish desires, so they will soon face the destruction. So the Quran specifies what the root cause of the problem of some of these people was. And it was their natural disposition being covered up by their selfish desires. There's a statement of the Prophet, a hadith, peace be upon him, about a dark spot that will form on the heart of a person every time they commit a sin. So every time they commit a sin, there's going to be dark spots on their heart forming up. And when enough spots build up, it's going to encompass and engulf the entire heart such that they cannot see right from wrong anymore. They cannot see good from evil. So they can't make any decision in reality because they're blinded. They can't tell what's right and they can't tell what's wrong. And then he says, and they will follow their selfish desires. So the selfish desires tend to pile up the more one goes and indulges in them and commits things which Allah deems to be inappropriate sins. And therefore it piles up such that they're not able to see anymore, and they've been taken away from this natural disposition. This is number one. Number two, arrogance. Okay, what is arrogance? We covered arrogance in quite a bit of detail in the class on spirituality. How do we understand arrogance? What exactly is arrogance? Just define it in a nutshell. Thinking that you're better than someone. What if you are better than someone? Still arrogance? Okay, so what differentiates thinking that you're better than someone? What if you're just clearly better than somebody else? I mean, you play, let's say, table tennis with them, and you beat them all the time. They can't even win a single game, for example. What do? You're better than them. Thinking that they're lower than you in that particular thing. But what if they are lower than you? They just can't win. They just can't hit the ball on the table. What do you do? Is that arrogant? For you to think, okay, this person just can't play. That's a symptom, attributing it to your own greatness. That's a symptom and that's a problem in and of itself. But that's not the root cause of the problem. There's something else. When you have too high of an opinion of yourself, and how do you get that? There's one thing I want to specify. Pride? Yeah, pride, but what causes the pride? Alright? You're legitimately good at something and other people are not good at that thing. What is causing that thing? Yes. It's showing off, but that's a symptom as well. What's the root? Praise. Praise is also a symptom. Not thanking Allah, that's also another part of the problem. Last chance. Huh? Overestimation of your own self. But in one particular case, what if you're better than that person? You're just clearly better than only that group of people who you're playing. You're better than all of them. Last one. Okay, that was said as well. What causes you to look down on someone? It's your this is Imam Ghazali saying. It's your magnification of your superior status over somebody else. When you zoom in and you start looking and start focusing on how great you are at this particular thing. You're good at this sport, you're good at this thing, you're good at whatever it is, you have a really nice car or whatever it is. When you start zooming in and you say, oh, this is what defines me. This particular trait. You may be awesome at this one thing or two things or 10 things. And you may be horrible at 10 other things. So when you start focusing and zooming in on that, that's when the pride starts coming in, and that's when you start looking down on other people, etc., etc. It keeps going down. Okay? So, then this leads to somebody thinking that only their own thoughts and only their own ideas are worthy of consideration. Because you zoomed in on yourself, now you're proud, and you say, oh, this person, I'm not going to listen to what they have to say about anything. Not about politics, not about religion, not about anything else. Who are they? They can't even hit the ball back, Or they can't even, they can't even get a car like me, or they can't even do whatever it may be. Right? So this is what causes pride, and this is what causes arrogance. Right? And people have natural characteristics. Some people are better at other things. Some of these things they're born with. Some of the things are acquired. But when you zoom in and magnify those things, you become arrogant. And that arrogance causes you to become blinded. And a great example of somebody who was blinded, well, here's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, your God is one God. As for those who do not believe in the hereafter, their hearts are defiant and they are arrogant. So Allah talks about the disease of arrogance. Right? One perfect example of an individual who is extremely arrogant to the core, to such an extent that he claimed to be God himself, was who? Fir'aun, the Pharaoh, right? So he is a perfect example, and yet his natural disposition began to manifest itself when he was drowning. When he realized that he cannot save himself anymore. So then he said, I believe now. But it was too late for him. Another example, and there's so many examples in the Quran, another example is the society of Ad. The people of Ad, Allah says, they showed arrogance in the land and they rejected our signs. So what was the reason, the root cause of the reason for rejecting the signs of Allah by the people of Ad? It's explained in the Quran as being their arrogance. It's not the fact that they couldn't be convinced. It's not the fact that a good argument didn't reach them. It was natural in their disposition to believe in those signs that Allah had sent them, but they rejected the signs because the arrogance had covered up the natural disposition such that it could not help them to arrive at the truth. Okay? And these are some of the effects of true arrogance. Right? The Prophet, peace be upon him, was asked whether or not it's a sign of arrogance to enjoy luxurious things and to not have anyone else outdo them in that. So there was one of the companions, he used to enjoy having nice things. Right? Imagine in our time today, if we were to explain what this companion was talking about. You want to have the best brand new smartphone, and you want to have the nicest watch, you want to have the nicest shirt which you traveled halfway around the world to get, and you want to have the nicest sofa, and you don't want anyone else to beat you in that. So somebody's asking the Prophet, what if you like those things? Does that mean you're arrogant because you want to be on top of other people and you don't want anyone else to outdo you in this regard? Is this arrogance? And the Prophet said, no, this is not arrogance. He said, arrogance, the real sign of arrogance is when you reject the truth and you disdain people. You look down upon people and you reject the truth. So he's trying to show, he wanted to clarify what are the true effects of arrogance on people. And this is it. So blind imitation is the, what number? The third? The third method, or the third thing that can block up the natural disposition. How does this work? What happens is when the other barriers, they start spreading among so many individuals that it starts to become part and parcel of the society. So that you have the effects of these barriers away from the natural disposition prevalent within a society. And oftentimes it's made to seem normal. So certain types of behaviors which are not natural are made to seem normal. And there's a big differentiation between what is natural and what is normal. And what ends up happening is these traits are passed on to subsequent generations through birth and through education and through training and all of that. Now what you're supposed to do is that when a person reaches the age of maturity, it's their job and their responsibility to remove these barriers that have been passed on to them. You could say inherited to them. But when there's no drive and there's no inclination to try and fix oneself and remove these barriers away, then that's what results in what we call blind imitation. The Arabic word is taqleed. And this taqleed refers to blindly imitating or blindly accepting the beliefs that are passed on to you without reflecting upon whether they're right or not, especially when they're wrong. Okay? So I'll explain a little bit more about what that means. But why does this happen? It happens for a number of reasons. It can happen because people are lazy. They just don't want to think. They don't want to focus on the serious things in life. Or it could also be something that comes out of people's desires, which is kind of go hand in hand. People are more interested in, drinking their coffee. People are more interested in watching movies. People are more interested in just socializing than to reflect upon the serious things in life, which are very important, and that refers to one's beliefs. The second main reason is that blind imitation may resemble a form of idolatry, as we mentioned before, and that is where there's this need to worship, forms this excessive respect for parents and elders of the society, such that no matter what they say, whether it's right or wrong, whether it agrees with natural disposition, whether it agrees with correct beliefs or not, it's taken anyways, just because of the source of where it's coming from. Okay, so excessive respect for elders in the community. Allah has mentioned in the Quran some examples. So Allah says, when it is said to them, follow what Allah has sent down. So Allah says in the Quran to certain people, when they're told by their prophets, follow what Allah has sent down, they say, no, instead, we will follow that religion on which we have found our forefathers. So it doesn't matter what Allah sends down, it matters what our forefathers have believed in, what they're actually doing or told us to believe in. And then Allah says, is it so, even though their forefathers had no understanding at all, nor had they been on the right path? So if somebody was misguided completely, somebody's teaching you the wrong thing, are you still going to use an argument and say, well, it doesn't matter because they're the seniors and the elders of the community, so we have to follow them anyways? And Allah is saying, even if they're wrong, even if they don't know what they're saying, and you're saying, yeah, even if they don't know what they're saying. So Allah is saying this is not a good excuse. And He says the example of calling people who have that mentality and they're stuck in that mentality and they're not willing to budge, it's as if those who disbelieve is such as someone who's shouting to an animal and the animal hears nothing and a cry. You can sit and you can shout at a cow and yell at it and say, you know what, get out of the way, what are you doing here? You're not supposed to be here, you're supposed to be in the other city. Go, get out of here. And the animal's just looking at you. What's wrong with this? This guy is crazy. Right? From the cow's perspective, right? You're the crazy one because you're moving around all over the place. Why can't you just be calm? Because he doesn't understand what you're saying. You're saying, get out of here. I told you, get out of here. Go walk over there. It's not going to move. So that's what's happening. They are deaf, dumb, and blind, so they do not understand. Another verse. They found their forefathers on the wrong path, but they still ran in their footsteps. Another verse. Similarly, we did not send a warner to a town before you, but its affluent people said, we have found our forefathers on a certain way, and we are following in their footsteps. He said, the Prophet said to them, even if I bring to you something better in guidance than that which you found your forefathers, and they said, we don't accept what you're saying. We reject what you came with, basically. So there are so many verses regarding this barrier to belief, this obstacle to belief, that it's a very, very common one. In fact, it's probably one of the most common beliefs there. Now, when we talked about the hadith, the statement of the Prophet where he said, all children are born with a natural disposition, and then it's his parents that make him into a Jew, or parents that make him into a Christian or a fire worshipper. The parents in that statement actually symbolize all influential factors in society that shape you. Whether it be your friends, whether it be your teachers, whether it be other family members, whether it be other people you interact with, whether it be the role models that you see on TV, people, TV figures and superheroes and all of that. Whatever it is that shapes you, and the reason why that's important is because today, in traditional societies, usually the parents had the most impact. Parents had the most impact over their children's upbringing and their beliefs. Today, that's changed quite a bit. So this is symbolic of anyone or any factors that shapes people. Okay, but at the same time, there's an opposite extreme. So this is one extreme, as mentioned in the Quran several times. But there's an opposite extreme. The opposite extreme is to rebel against your inherited beliefs just for the sake of rebelling, such that you actually end up rejecting something that was true in the first place. So that's what happens when it comes to Muslims. So some Muslims may, for example, get the idea that, well, I need to make sure that I am not a blind follower of my parents, therefore I'm going to reject everything that they're saying, and I'm going to arrive at something different. But the point is to not be different for the sake of being different. The point is not to be different for the sake of being independent. The point is not to rebel for the sake of whatever. But in reality, what really happens for most people is that they're going to inherit some beliefs which are correct, and they're going to inherit some beliefs which are incorrect. So the effort that you actually put in to find out true beliefs or come back to the natural disposition of true beliefs is what? What does the process resemble? Resembles a filter, right? You're striving, when you reach the age of maturity, to come back to the natural disposition is supposed to resemble a filter which takes the beliefs that you were taught and it keeps the good ones and it filters out and removes the bad ones. Right? That's what it's designed to do, and that applies to everyone. It doesn't just apply to Muslims, it doesn't just apply to non-Muslims, because things that they were taught as well, who are not Muslim, or people who grew up without Islam, they're also taught certain things that were correct. And Muslims will grow up with certain things which they were taught that are incorrect. So everyone needs to process through this filter. So there is there's an amount of work that's required for everybody. Okay? So it's like a filter that processes out. All right. What are some of the methods that people can use to become aware of this natural disposition? Meaning, what techniques can you use? Okay? The reason why this is important to talk about is because there's a very common excuse that people bring up. And people bring up the excuse once they understand all of these things. They say, look, if somebody inherited an unnatural disposition, then it's not fair for the people who inherited, it's not fair to them compared to the people who inherited the correct natural disposition. Which means people who grew up with firm, believing, true Muslim parents who taught their kids the true form of Islam, and they grew up that way, they have an advantage over the other people. They have an unfair advantage over other people who grew up in families which taught them to do all sorts of weird things, or taught them all sorts of strange beliefs. Right? Imagine someone has the most ridiculous or the strangest or the weirdest beliefs, the furthest away from true beliefs. And one person grows up with that, and one person grows up on the pristine, clear path of Islam with correct faith, and their parents are very, dedicated Muslims, and they're teaching them in a really nice way, and they took a lot of classes, they knew how to teach their kids. The thing is, this is a very common argument. So what's the answer? What's the response to this argument? Okay, so if you're saying you have the capacity to think and reflect in order to arrive at the right beliefs, the question is everybody equipped with that? So Allah knows the circumstances of what that person was capable of. Okay, so what are they capable of? Okay, that's fine. The judgment will be based on the circumstances in which they grew up. But once they reach the age of maturity, right, then they're considered to be held responsible from the Islamic perspective, right? How can you hold somebody, this is the question, how can you hold somebody responsible when somebody else has somebody else been given an unfair advantage or not? How do you explain that? They both have intellect. Is their intellect on par, or is it sufficient, is it almost equal? No, I mean, okay, we don't mean equal intellect, meaning that do they both have intellect such that each one of them would have arrived, that could have arrived at the truth had they wanted to? No, we're not talking about information. When you said intellect, we're talking about intellect, right? Meaning ability to reason and figure things out, to figure out the truth, right? So do both of them equally have the ability to figure out the truth? Because it would be unfair if they didn't. So Abdul Ghani is explaining that it must be fair, and therefore the way we understand it is both of them have the ability to see the truth despite their upbringing. That's what you're saying. Okay? Who would like to elaborate on that point? Yeah, when we say intellect, we're combining heart and intellect as one. But answering those questions, when you start questioning, answering those questions is based upon the intellect and the heart and all of that, right? So here's the question then. So somebody who's raised really religious, right? Proper beliefs. Have you ever seen those type of people go away from Islam? Okay. Somebody who's raised with the worst belief ever, have you seen them come to Islam? Okay, now the question is, what caused that? How did that happen? And we can't just say, oh, Allah did it. Okay, explain in detail. I mean, not in detail, but give some explanation. How did that happen? How do we understand that phenomena Islamically? Self-evaluation, okay. What else? External factors, like? Okay, so that was that kind of got them to start thinking, but was it primarily external or internal? No, which one takes precedence in the decision? Internal, right? It can't be external, because otherwise 9/11 happened, it affected both people, right? So it can't be the external fact, it has to be the internal. So internally, there has to be something that people have equally across the board, such that they're able to come back to the natural disposition. And that's why Sister Andrea made a good observation, and she said, all sane people. Right? So what about people who are not sane? Islamically, they're not held responsible. So therefore, they don't qualify. So all sane people who are completely sane, and Allah knows the definition of sane and not sane, right? They have something in common such that they have a fair chance to comprehend and understand the truth, and to search for the truth, and to accept the truth. That's what Islam teaches. Because it has to be fair across the board. So it's not, what's important is not just the upbringing when it comes to fairness. It's the abilities that a person has been given such that they can arrive at the truth. And this is an ability, despite different people's intellects. One person may be a brilliant mathematician. Another person may be a brilliant inventor. And yet both of them have radically different beliefs. Alright? So that's one form of intellect. But when we're talking about something which gets them to a belief which is shared and common, which is arriving at the ultimate truth. Okay? So let's take a look at how this works. Okay? So that's why it's not a valid excuse, because they have the faculties. Everyone who's sane is equipped with the faculties to remove those barriers and to arrive back at the natural disposition and the true belief. So what are these methods? So every human being is equipped with that. What are these methods? There are 4 methods which scholars have mainly talked about, and we'll comment a little bit on each of them. One of them is the method of intuition. The second is method of revelation. Third is the method of experience. And the fourth is the method of reflection. And then we'll talk about which one is the best or the correct one. Okay? The method of intuition. So what is intuition? It's that feeling that you just have, something that you just know, something that's just self-evident. It's just clear. Like for example, okay? How many of you believe that you exist? Less than 50% of the class. Who believes that they exist? Raise your hand. Alright? Hopefully you didn't watch too much of the Matrix and all that. It messed up your mind and all that stuff. Philosophy and all that. Most people, almost all people believe that they exist. Right? How did they prove that to themselves? Did they ever sit down and say, how do I know that? I have to establish some kind of proof. I have to figure this out, because it's not something you can just believe with blind faith. I need to go beyond blind faith, and I need to prove to myself that I exist. Now people have done that. Rene Descartes and all of that, they've written books on, I think therefore I am, and all these different ways of proving it. But you didn't have to prove that, right? You didn't have to say, well, because I'm thinking therefore I must exist somehow. You didn't prove that. It's something that is there, known through intuition. It's self-evident. You don't even discuss it. No one really gets into discussions regarding this. So the same way, belief in Allah, one of the arguments is that it's known through intuition. It's self-evident. It doesn't even require discussion. And you will meet several people who are very convinced. You can sit there and say, well, I can't believe you don't believe in Allah. It doesn't make any sense. How could you possibly even entertain the idea that you don't believe in God, that He created everything? That's almost as ridiculous as believing that you yourself don't exist, or that I don't exist. So there are people who've used the method of intuition, and they've argued that this is a proof, okay, without needing to have some rational proofs or something like that. The evidence for this position is a verse in the Quran, which says, their prophet said, is it in Allah that you have some doubt, who is the creator of the heavens and the earth? So the prophets were telling their people, do you really have doubt in Allah, who's the creator? So basically the second argument is that prophets never needed to call people to believing the existence of Allah. Do you ever find any prophet mentioned in the Quran which tried to convince the people that, look, you have to believe that Allah exists? And they didn't believe Allah exists, so they're trying to show them how Allah exists. There's no prophet. Not a single prophet had to do that. Was there? So they were taking the planets and the stars as their gods, right? But did they believe in Allah at the same time? Yeah. Most scholars will explain that and say, yes, they also believed. All the idolaters, they also believed in Allah. So it's not the existence part. Right? That's why he said, my Lord is Allah who doesn't go away and all of that. So meaning that they believed these things were their Lord, and He's modifying their beliefs. Okay, but perhaps that could be an example to the contrary. But for the most part, almost all prophets have taught mainly about the oneness of Allah and about the attributes of Allah. They did not generally have to go and put proofs out there for the existence of Allah. So there's an argument that because it's intuitive, you don't need to actually explain it, you don't need to call people. Now the response to this argument is, what is the response to this argument outside of the verse of Prophet Ibrahim? A very simple response. What is the counter argument to this position? How do you have atheists? Right? Where did atheists come from? How did they go against their own intuition? Right? And there's quite a few of them now. Right? They may not be the majority in history, but there's quite a few of them. How did this happen? If it's so self-evident, so clear, how did this happen? So that's one argument. The second argument against this is that if it's so self-evident, why does the Quran ask us to use our minds to reflect upon the signs of Allah? So if it's so clear and so evident and you don't need to think, then why did Allah ask us to think? That's the second argument against this. The third argument against this is that the verse was not actually saying that no prophet had ever come to people who did not believe in Allah, because it's not exclusive. It's not talking about all the prophets. Because the prophets have different communities that they were sent to, and the Quran does not mention every single possible argument that they've ever made. So there's three responses to this. Okay? So the method of intuition basically works really well when somebody already has a sound nature, when they already are on the natural disposition to be on the correct beliefs. So it's good to keep somebody on that. However, it's not a very good method or not a very effective method for bringing people back, because it's not a very productive discussion that you can have with someone who's denying and say, well, it's self-evident. You say, well, no, it's not self-evident. Yes, it is. And you should just understand it. You just have a problem, and you can't really get anywhere with somebody by arguing that. And I know several Muslims do that. And they say, it doesn't even need proof. And they say, well, convince me. I don't even need to convince you. That's how clear it is. And you're just messed up. This is a discussion that's going nowhere. You might as well talk to the wall, because there's no point in having that discussion. So it may work for people, but it does not serve as a good method to be trying to spread the message of Islam or convince somebody else to come back to the faith. The second method is the method of revelation. The method of revelation is that it's been argued by Muslim scholars is the only way to know Allah and to know all of these beliefs is by believing in the revelation of Allah. This is the only way you can actually know Allah. The intellect, you only use your intellect for accepting the revelation. Once you've accepted the revelation, the belief in Allah and the belief in the Prophet and everything, it all comes directly from the revelation. Alright? You just understand the text. If you understand what the Quran is saying correctly, that is sufficient for you to establish all the beliefs that you need, and there's no other way, and there's nothing else to worry about. Now, there's no doubt that obviously this is a sound method, and this is a method to establish belief in Allah, but it should not be considered the only method. And the reason why it's not considered the only method is because revelation may not have a sufficient impact on a person due to the barriers to the natural disposition that they already have on their hearts. So it could be that someone who already has barriers and who's not believing in revelation, if you want to convince them that Allah exists and that the Prophet is true, they may not be willing to look into the revelation itself, right? Because they already have these barriers and they're away from it. So that may not be the best way. The second thing is, they may not be able to understand the revelation properly due to language barriers. Maybe they don't have a Quran translated into their language. It could be that the person who was explaining to them the message of Islam didn't explain it in a very good, clear way that makes sense. And unfortunately, there are several Muslims who mashallah, they're trying to convey the message of Islam, but they do a very poor job of it. All right? And many people have probably seen that. So that person may not be convinced by that. So another reason is that many people, if they want to believe in the revelation, if they want to believe in the Quran, for example, a lot of people who don't believe in Allah, they say, well, I need to believe in Allah first before I'm willing to believe in the book from Allah. But you're telling me to believe in the book in order to establish my belief in Allah. Now you can argue both ways, but it may not work for everyone. Therefore, it may not suffice as the only method or the best method for convincing somebody about the legitimacy of beliefs. Okay? Limitations. Okay, so I already mentioned that. And then the fourth argument against that is, why would the Quran ask people to reflect upon things which are outside the Quran? Like the signs in the heavens and the earth and in nature and all of these things. Why would it ask them to reflect on something outside the Quran if the Quran was the only thing you're supposed to be reflecting on directly? Okay, so this is some of the counter arguments. The third is the method of experience. And then we'll stop here and then we'll talk about the fourth method next week, inshallah. The method of experience are people who emphasized the importance of spirituality, the importance of cleansing your heart of its desires. Particularly people in like the Sufi tradition and all of that. They said, once you clean your heart of desires, you get this special knowledge of Allah, and the light of Allah manifests itself such that you know Allah in a way that no one else can know Him through His intelligence or anything like that. It gives you a level of certainty that you cannot arrive at through your intellection or through even reading books of tafsir or books of commentary or whatever it is. So basically what they're saying is you remove these desires, anger, pride, envy, hatred, ostentation, all these things, you purify yourself, you fast and you pray and you pray and you pray and you pray. And the more you do all of these things, Allah gives you this special knowledge such that you know Him. Okay? Now the response to this method of knowing Allah, based on self-reform and spirituality, has been that the average person will not be able to strive to that level of giving up all these things and praying all of that and fasting all of that before they can actually get to a knowledge of Allah. The second is that this method would require people to be almost perfect, like really pious people, before they have knowledge of Allah, rather than vice versa, where you know Allah and you believe in revelation to make yourself a better person. So you use your belief to strengthen your connection with Allah. So these are the counter arguments against it. This is known as the method of experience. And so it's good for strengthening faith, but again, it's not something that you can generally have other people do. You can't convince them to, you know what, I want you to pray 5 hours a day and I want you to fast every other day. And I'm telling you, within a year, you're going to see the reality of the truth. It's not likely to get people, to convince them. So that's these are three methods. The ideal method and the universal method is the method of reflection, which is what we'll talk about next week, inshallah ta'ala. So, opening up to questions. Any questions? Okay, good question. So the question is, the person asked about wanting to have all the luxuries and all of that. Isn't that materialism, or isn't that vanity, at least? Wanting to be on top of everyone for everything. Yes, absolutely. It's definitely not a good characteristic. But what he was trying to tell that person is that feeling that you have. It doesn't even mean that the person was doing that. But the feeling that you have, that kind of feeling, is not the equivalent of arrogance. That's what he meant. He said the real effects of arrogance come in denying the truth and putting other people down. That's a good observation. So basically what he's saying is that the person who grew up Muslim, they're more likely to see the truth because they grew up with that. The person who didn't grow up that way, they're more likely to see all the erroneous beliefs because they've been so exposed to that eventually through their experience in life, they're going to see how false these things really are and see what they lead to. So it'll have an effect on them to go back towards the truth. Okay, any other questions? Yes, so the question is, do desires, if they lead you away from the natural disposition, aren't the desires natural? Yes, the desires of eating, a sufficient amount of food, the desires of drinking water, the desires of procreation and all of that, these are natural. But the desires, meaning when the desires are out of balance and they go to the extreme, such that you start eating so much that you get sick. So an excessive acting upon that desire is a form of extreme. So when we say following desires, we mean following extreme desires in reality. So therefore that's not natural. It is worship something else. Yeah, meaning like Marx and Lenin and Stalin and statues and the flag and all of these things. So they've replaced worshipping nothing to actually showing extreme reverence to other things, which is almost like a form of worship. No, they're still atheists, but they've replaced God with something else. So they worship a flag, for example, or an idea, for example. Yeah, so no religion basically, or nihilist, or whatever it may be, right? People who don't believe in anything, or they have no purpose of life, or whatever it is. You can define whatever you could give a term for whatever you want them to have. They could have their own term, right? But by having a term for them, what is that? Does that help us, or you just wanted to know the term? You're not believing in anything at all. Okay, how do you explain it? You should explain these are the barriers that someone has put, so many barriers on their natural disposition, such that they have no inclination for anything. So everything has been covered up. That's it. Let's say you meet somebody who doesn't believe in their own existence. How would you no, there are people like that. They don't believe they exist. Right? No, I'm telling you, there are people like that. Right? How do you explain that? Oh, I have met them. Oh, trust me, I've met them. I have met them, absolutely. Go visit a philosophy department at a university, and you'll see some of the professors, they actually believe that. Right? They can't argue whether this is a reality or it's a dream. And they're really messed up about that. You'll find them. I guarantee you'll find them. The thing is, how do you explain that? You explain that is that that's not natural to believe that, but they've gone away. It's like the same way as explaining why do people feel comfortable walking around naked completely? Right? Even happens today, right? You go to 24-hour fitness or something like that. You walk into the gym and you can't believe it. 60-year-old guy or something like that, he's just walking around like it's nothing. You've seen, yeah, you guys have seen that, right? Yeah, you've seen. That's why you're laughing, because you've seen it, right? And you couldn't imagine. You thought like some young guy would do something stupid like or something like that, right? But it's like some old guy who's doing it. You're like, what the heck, right? That's it. How do you explain that? Barrier, just it became a norm. That it's not natural, but it became a norm for them because of all these barriers that have built up. Doesn't mean that it's natural. Right? So that's that. Inshallah, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us and guide us at all times to understand these things and to practice them and to apply them in our daily lives. Ameen. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati yawma yasifun wa salamun ala al-mursaleen walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum.